Thanks very much for weathering the weather and being here with us on this not too easy day in terms of rain and wind and so forth. I'm Luis Fraga, the director of the Institute for Latino Studies and professor of political science, and I'm very happy to welcome you to an important session that we put together to celebrate, so to speak, Black History Month, but also to address an important perennial issue that is no reason to celebrate here in the United States. And to help us do that is Professor David Cortez, an assistant professor of political science who has research interests that center on ethnic and racial identity with a particular focus on intersectional, intersectional and situational identity salience. His current book project, entitled, make sure I get it here, Broken Mirrors, Latinos, La Migra, and the Conflict of Being, both, which is under review at Oxford University Press, and we all expect it to receive a great number of accolades and awards and all sorts of things, having been around several presentations that David has made of it. It's just a magnificent exploration of intersectional identities. In it, he explores the emergence of a disproportionately Latinx immigration law enforcement workforce as a metaphor for the minority experience in the United States. Drawing on extensive fieldwork, including interviews with and observations of more than 100 immigrant and customs enforcement, ICE in other words, agents across Texas, Arizona, and California, his research engages questions of belonging, obligation, and liminality, the in-betweenness, to reveal the careful negotiation of cross-cutting social group memberships of Latinx immigration agents caught between two worlds, the police and the policed. His recent article in the Political Research Quarterly, entitled Latinxes in La Migra, Why They Joined and Why It Mattered, was awarded the 2022 Best Article Award by the Political Research Quarterly. Here at Notre Dame, he teaches a number of classes, one of them, Race and Policing in the United States, another one, The Politics of Borders, another one, Latinos in U.S. Politics, and yet another one, American Citizenship in the 21st Century, and a graduate seminar entitled Encounters with the State. Anyone who has had any chance to interview or interact with Professor Cortez knows that he has one of the most perceptive and powerful minds regarding these issues of law enforcement, the state, and we thought it appropriate, if not absolutely necessary, to see what we can learn from him about what seems to be perennial situation we're in, where some police, not all of course, but some police seem to continually use excessive force as a way of trying to comply with what they understand to be their obligations for law enforcement. I'm going to ask David a set of questions for maybe about half an hour, 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So please think of your questions and write down your questions. He's very open to taking any questions that you have and will be great at responding to them. David received his bachelor's degree from the University of Texas
Pan
American, and his PhD from Cornell University in
2017,
and he loves the snow, and that's the reason that he's back here. He and his family are back here at Notre Dame. So, David, I wanted to start with a couple of softballs. How did you become interested in this area of research?
Oh boy. So this is a really good question. First, I want to say thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. I also want to say that obviously in this month of February, Black History Month, that I myself am not Black, but am here and know what I know and am a quote unquote expert in law enforcement, things of that nature, because I stand on the shoulder of countless Black scholars, activists, and ultimately, unfortunately, victims of police violence and state violence. And it's due to them that I know anything of what I'm talking about up here. So I just wanted to say that and be clear about that up front. But I became interested in issues of race and law enforcement primarily because I grew up, I think like most people do, with an understanding of law enforcement as this indispensable institution in society, in the country that we live in, right, and in our local communities. But I also experienced law enforcement from the perspective of somebody who's non-white. And at the same time, and when I say that, I should say I've had police officers point guns at me. I've been handcuffed and slammed to the ground. I've had knees in my back and slammed against vehicles, and all in the case of mistaken identity, which of course can tend to leave somewhat of a specific attitude or perception, But at the same time, I also, like many people, have family members who work in law enforcement. And who, from my understanding, seem like really great people. People committed to public safety, people committed to the greater good, people committed to creating safe communities and the like. And thus end up in this position of trying to make sense of what we know to be true, not just in recent history, but since the advent of modern policing in the United States. And caught between that and wanting to, or believing in some sort of social order. And of course, knowing people who do this and do it well. But I also, as a political scientist, was fascinated by the fact that, as scholars like Veshla Weaver and Joe Sauce have pointed out, contact with the police is the primary way that people make contact with government. This is their primary point of contact with governing institutions, right? They are our government, as Joe Sauce and Veshla Weaver so poignantly put it. And actually, I wanted to ask a question because I was thinking about this earlier today. When was the last time, or has anybody had contact with the police in the last month? You have? Okay. And I saw like one other hand. Nobody else? One hand? How about in the last 2 weeks? No? So my last interaction with the police was at 2 a.m. this morning, driving into South Bend from Chicago with a couple of friends. We went to go catch a concert. And I'm sitting in the vehicle with 4 middle-aged white men. I shouldn't say middle-aged, so my age, late 30s or early 40s.
That's very young. That's very young from my perspective.
And it was the most polite interaction I've ever experienced. And not to say that every interaction is bad, but I was left sitting in the car after that interaction where there was no ticket, no citation given or anything like that for going 15 miles over the speed limit in the middle of the night, obviously. But I was left thinking, is this what it's like to be white? Because I've been stopped in situations like that before with a bunch of other Latino men in the vehicle, and we were all separated on the side of the road by about 10 feet apiece and told to wait while our vehicle was, inspected. This is all a long-winded answer to get to the fact that I've been fascinated by these issues for quite some time, both from a personal perspective, but also from a scholarly perspective as a political scientist. And I've been fortunate enough, as I said, to learn from so many great scholars before me and activists before me, and trying to find my own little piece of the area of inquiry for me to plug myself into.
We have all heard of the recent tragedies of the excessive use of force by agents of the state. And have they become more rampant in recent times, or are they just more apparent today because of our cell phones and body cameras and other cameras that capture these interactions in a way that they could not have been captured in the past?
So this is a really great question. And one of the questions that I deal with, or my students and I deal with in my class on race and policing. And the answer, the unfortunate answer is it's unclear. It's difficult to tell. Now, recent studies suggest that fatal encounters with the police in the last several years are actually on the rise. That being said, scholars still maintain that fatal encounters with the police are exceedingly rare. That doesn't make those of us who care about these issues feel very good. Well, maybe it does, right? It's kind of a double-edged sword. But of course, that's only when we focus on fatal encounters, and thus those encounters that maybe we don't hear so much about because they don't end in the death of an unarmed black or brown man. But you're absolutely right with the advent of social media and video cameras, essentially, that are able to be live streamed, at an instant, that we see so much more of encounters between civilians and the police, including Philando Castile, whose murder was live streamed on Facebook, and one of the primary reasons why it's difficult to tell if these incidents are increasing in frequency is that our data is really bad.
Do you think that's by design?
So that's a tough question too. I try not to ascribe or assign motive, right, to these kinds of things. But, when we actually did start instituting formal police forces in the United States, they were by design set up to be as decentralized as possible. And so I think recent studies estimate that there's 18,000 distinct police forces across the United States. With their own specific policies, their own specific training guidelines, their own specific use of force protocols, their own specific data collection methods. And thus, we don't have a strong centralized source of data or reporting scheme, because even the national level FBI data clearinghouses have been shown to underestimate the number of fatal encounters between civilians and the police. So we might make of that what we we might, right? But it's clear that many of these incidents, especially those that don't end in death, either go unreported or are underreported.
I was trying to find data on the number of incidents of deaths And I could not distinguish between those that were, if you'll permit me, justified, and those that were not justified. Justified as in the alleged perpetrator having a weapon, having fired a weapon, and so forth. Is that your experience, or am I just not looking in the right place?
My experience, is it my experience that the data...
That the data are ambiguous on that specific point?
Yes. So there are, Mapping Police Violence is one of the NGOs that, of course,
Right.
collects data on this. But again, the fact that we don't have a kind of centralized data collection process around the country is partly at fault there. We should also be clear that the reports of what a particular assailant or civilian might have been doing at the time when they were killed by police, those reports are written by the police officers, right? Not to again impugn motive or anything or assign motive there, but again, this is one of those questions that I think begs us to look inward a little bit more than just at the surface level of thinking about justified versus unjustified. We do obviously have some data with respect to unarmed people being killed, and of course these are the cases that tend to make it to the national level news that we hear about. They're the cases that I actually have my students learn about and then present to the class, present to their peers. And unfortunately, every time I teach that class, I'm going through an increasingly larger list of names. The one thing that we do know, though, about that distinction between justified or the killing of unarmed civilians versus what are seen as justifiable homicides, right, is that Blacks and Latinos are disproportionately represented in that category, right? So relative to their proportion of the overall population, they make up a much larger proportion of those people who are unarmed and killed by police. But when I said earlier about the normative assessment there is that we should, however, still be very uncomfortable about police killing anybody in the line of duty. And of course, it's easy for me to say that as somebody sitting up here on a stage that feels a lot like a talk show. But part of the arrangement that we have with police is essentially granting them the legitimate use of force, right? A monopoly on the legitimate use of force, to borrow Max Weber's language there. And we entrust that the state is using that monopoly on justified violence appropriately. But we should be unsettled by any loss of life at the hands of the state, especially one that is so decentralized and subject to all of the biases and illnesses that we have, mental illnesses, I should say, that we have in this country. As I try to impart on my students from one semester to the next, policing, the police as an institution, are only as good as the society that they exist in, right? These police forces don't exist in a vacuum. They're subject to the same history of racial oppression, anti-blackness, anti-brownness that just exists in our culture. I know that's again, I've kind of gone off the rails with an answer.
No, very good. No.
Yeah.
So what would you say are the primary similarities and differences in excessive use of force by police and other governmental agents, such as you argue, between African Americans and Latinos?
Well, we tend, of course, to see, because of much of the news coverage across the country, that those who are disproportionately, either roughed up, assaulted, or killed by police are Black men, Black women, and what tends to get lost in that story, though, is the number of young Latino men who are killed or roughed up by the police, or in other ways kind of involved in, if not kind of pushed into, the criminal justice system. And this, again, has a long history in the United States, dating back to, of course, some of the more prevalent cases of the 1940s in Los Angeles and the LAPD's kind of brutal treatment of Mexican Americans. But there's another element to it when we're talking about how Latinos, what Latino encounters are like with the police, because we add the element of citizenship status, right? And the kind of what's been referred to by scholars as the immigrant shadow, or the perpetual foreignness that reads on the faces of brown men and women across the country. And of course, the cooperation between local municipal authorities and federal level immigration authorities adds an added layer of, what's the word I'm looking for? An added layer of tension, right? An added layer of precarity, I should say. It's not just municipal or state police or county police or anything like that. It is always kind of the back end of the threat of immigration law enforcement becoming involved.
Which is a large part of what you research in your book.
Yes.
Which I'll ask you about a little more in just a minute. How do you explain the role of, and I know this is part of what you address in your book as well, how do you explain the role of race or ethnicity, both as targets and as officers of the state, in how they play or should play in deeply understanding the use of excessive force? I know you've made reference to some of this before, but is this part of a longer, as you suggested, racial ethnic history in the United States? Is it the identifiability of people? But the recent case that we had of 5 African American officers in Memphis being accused of killing an African American man, it just, we see that these things are not as crystal clear in the depth of understanding if you just understand it in terms of black and white or black and brown. So how do you, as a scholar of these issues and in teaching over the years, how do you explain this? So
I typically go back to the Kerner Commission report authored in 1968. I know now just eons ago, right? Or it feels like eons ago. But actually, if you go back to read this report that was commissioned by Lyndon Johnson on social disorder in American cities.
Was that in 68, David?
68? Yeah, he commissioned it in 67?
65, 67?
Okay, I think around then, but the publication 60s. I want to say is 68.
Okay.
I could be wrong. But if you read it, one of the, I think, most startling elements of it in the kind of intro and overview of their study, it reads like you're reading it in 2015. It reads like you're reading it in 2022. It feels like you're reading it in 1994 or 1996, after the beating of Rodney King, which is, startling all on its own. But I bring this up to highlight that back in that report, one of the proposed solutions to tension, rather, or poor relations between the police and communities of color was the absence, or rather the dearth of minority police officers, black and brown police officers, essentially, in black and brown neighborhoods. And this led to, of course, the hiring of many more black and brown people to become police officers, or in the case of my research, immigration law enforcement agents, which adds another kind of layer of complexity to it. And that's not to say that these were the first police forces that, had racial and ethnic minorities on them. The first black police officers actually date back to 1806 in Louisiana, who were, just to be clear, brought on the police force to police the slave population, police your own people, essentially. And of course, if you think back to the case of Mike Brown, again, there's way too many cases to be mentioned all in one, but think back to the case of Mike Brown. A lot of the arguments being made in the aftermath of that were, if the police force were less white, if it were more racially or ethnically diverse, perhaps we wouldn't have these kinds of outcomes. But this is an argument that's, like I said, been made since the late 60s, and there's no real sign, no definitive sign that more diverse police agencies lead to better outcomes or better relations with black and brown or minoritized communities. That's not to say that there aren't benefits to it, or that there aren't cases where we see black and brown police officers exerting or exhibiting extra empathy or extra going above and beyond the call of duty in interactions with those communities. But it's not a panacea, right? It's not a silver bullet, as it were. And the case of Tyree Nichols that you alluded to a bit ago, where it was 5 black police officers who engaged in a just brutal beating and murder, is one of those things that kind of tends to boggle people's minds, right? The expectation is, well, if it's about racism, if the police are racist, then it must be white police officers beating down and killing young black men, young brown men, young black women. But of course, we know that that's not exactly the case. And what we're talking about here isn't maybe necessarily racism, but anti-blackness, anti-non-whiteness. And those kinds of attitudes, those kinds of knee-jerk responses, again, come from the socialization into the racial order of the United States. These things are deeply ingrained in us, dating as far back to who we said in 1790 could be a member of the political community, who was a citizen in the United States. Our first Naturalization Act said, you can be a citizen here, but you got to be a free white man. And all of this is deeply rooted in our psyche, so it's not impossible. And of course, we have plenty of evidence of it, that anti-blackness can be, racist behavior can be exhibited by people who are skin folk, as you know, the common phrase goes. Not all skin folk are, not all skin folk are kinfolk, right? But it doesn't mean, again, that there's no room for commonality there. And that's what, with my research, I tried to get a little bit better insight on.
Talk to us about your book. It's a nice way to segue into your book.
Yeah, thank you. Latinos
It's
today...
fabulous, by the way. I've read several chapters.
Oh, thank you.
It's just magnificent.
Latinos today make up a disproportionate number of immigration law enforcement agents in the United States. They're relative to their proportion of the overall population, they're overrepresented in the ranks of Border Patrol and ICE, with Latinos making up nearly 30% of Immigration and Customs Enforcement ERO, which is what we tend to think of when we think of ICE, and 50% of Border Patrol agents. Now again, the typical party line from these agencies is, well, we need people that can communicate effectively with their targets, with the communities that they're engaged with, and have some sort of at least cultural competency with the people that they encounter on a daily basis. The agents themselves, though, exist at this really fascinating, at least to me, intersection of being both Latino and essentially the either the descendants of immigrants or immigrants themselves, but also policing that act, right? Policing the act that if it hadn't been for someone in their family immigrating, they wouldn't be standing in the shoes that they are. And so I having grown up in South Texas, in Brownsville, Texas, this was a dynamic that I could see very plainly, right? And always raised questions for me, of course, rooted in this notion that there's something odd about Latinos who engage in this kind of work. But I wanted to understand how they thought about it more. How do you balance being both an insider and an outsider, not just in the community or the community of Latinos or immigrant communities, but also in an institution that has its own origins tied to the racial order of the United States. And so I spent ultimately about 13 months across Arizona, Texas, and California, getting to know these people. And over that period of time, I interviewed a little more than 100 ICE agents, with more than half of them being Latinos themselves.
How long were these interviews?
Anywhere from 30 minutes among the more monosyllabic people who were, Marines by training. And we're happy to answer every question with a yes or no. But even those interviews are kind of rife with fascinating tidbits, to as long as 3.5, 4 hours. And then really as an aspiring ethnographer at the time, I continued talking with these people and got into texting type of relationships with some of them. Oddly enough, in some cases with some agents saying, when I would thank them for their help, hey, it's no problem, it's a raza thing. Which for me highlighted, okay, this ethnic identity thing, this racial identity thing to them means something. Their jobs also obviously mean something. Their identities as immigration agents or federal agents. A lot of them take that very seriously as well. And so my fascination with trying to understand how they balance those things manifested in a book that is really gray. In a world of blacks and whites, right? In a world of absolutes, there are very few broad brushstrokes in the book manuscript, because for many of these people, it's somewhere in the middle, right? They're trying to kind of split the difference between who they are and what they do. And ultimately, I highlight that it's a daily process of trying to find belonging somewhere while lacking full membership everywhere. They're kind of stuck between communities that see them as vendidos, as sellouts, or having turned their back on their people, and then seen by their non-Latino peers in law enforcement as, well, maybe not really one of us, and somewhat suspicious. How they maneuver in that space is essentially ultimately what I describe as the story of the minority experience in the United States. Trying to become, it's essentially what W.B. Du Bois said as trying to live a double consciousness, right? He described it as being impossible to be Black and American at the same time. And this is a story that we see kind of repeating in this obviously different environment.
That's why it's such an interesting book. So what do you think of recent calls to reform police departments that range from defunding to better training and conflict resolution to not having officers involved at all when there is no threat of violence, but rather having some sort of social worker or conflict resolution specialist division in city government generally, maybe state government, but certainly city government, handle cases of that sort? What are your views as to which one is likely to be better, or what's most likely to work, if anything?
So again, standing on the shoulders of giants before me, I would consider myself an abolitionist. If we want to live in a world where the police do not kill civilians, we have to live as though that's actually possible, right? We have to open our minds to a world where that is possible. And the abolition of slavery, in antebellum America, was seen as unfathomable, right? The abolition of Jim Crow was seen as unfathomable. And in order to get to a place where people don't live in fear of the police, don't live in fear of calling the police when they need help. Again, most minoritized communities in the country would describe, or have been shown to describe, feeling simultaneously underserved and over-policed. Right? We like the police to do good things in our community, but that maybe is not always the case, right? Mm-hmm. Or that is definitely not always the case. Then we have to act as though police can go. And the reason I say that is that there are, of course, myriad examples across the world of policing institutions, right? Not all police look like they do in the United States, and not all of them have a use of force kind of protocol that we do in the United States, nor do they benefit from some of the kind of legal structures designed to protect police in their split-second decision-making. But as I point back to with my students when we do our historical review of the development of American policing, scholars have described it as having a dual heritage, right? Of course, it's nice to think of us essentially adopting the London police model in the early 19th century, actually in the mid 19th century. 1853, I think, is when we first dressed police officers in New York City. But it also has roots in the slave patrols of the South and slave catchers in the North. And if a tree has roots, some really good roots and some really bad roots, we might question the kind of fruit that tree bears. And again, as an abolitionist, if we open ourselves to those kinds of possibilities, that maybe there are other ways of doing order maintenance, or caring for communities when they're in crisis, that don't involve somebody showing up with a firearm, let alone a tank, then we won't actually make any progress, right? If then progress becomes somewhat locked off to us. And again, if we're at this point, post civil rights era, post 1968 with the Kerner Commission report, post the mid 90s kind of riots in California and Los Angeles, 2015 in St. Louis and Minneapolis, the countless demonstrations that have gone on across the country, and of course the countless examples of police violence. It seems like insanity for us to be continuing to think that this system, as currently constituted, will produce better fruit.
We've actually passed our time to be able to engage with questions from the audience. But one last question. What else should we know about the excessive use of a police force that is not generally known or understood in the American public? You as a scholar, you as an instructor, as a teacher, what else should we know?
So this is actually, I think, where my expertise might lie, is thinking about policing as a two-way as a two-way experience, right? As a two-way process. And most of the time, of course, we think about the victims of police violence, and rightly so. I, of course, given the kind of research that I've done, am much more fascinated by the people that constitute the state, constitute the elements of government that we come into contact with. Who are the people that are actually doing the work? Has become, of course, the questions that I'm most fascinated by, and not only who they are, but how they think, what brought them to these lines of work. And I think one of the more important things to focus on that most people maybe don't, even though we obviously have the conversations, right, when we think about more diverse police agencies and the like, is that it matters who we entrust with the kind of authority that we do to law enforcement officers. It matters how they think about themselves. It matters where they've come from. It matters what kind of behavior they've engaged in before. A recent study by investigative journalists at NPR have highlighted that among those police officers engaged that have been involved in the killing of unarmed civilians, or the shooting of unarmed civilians at least, that wasn't the only instance that they had fired their service weapon before at unarmed civilians before, or had been had a history of domestic violence, or had had negative encounters off duty with other police officers and the like. And so I think, again, in trying to reimagine what the police could be in the United States, if we wanted to move away from this highly decentralized 18,000 unit system of policing across the country, then we need to think strongly about what kind of people we want in those roles, and whether they see every problem as a nail waiting to be hammered in, or whether they see every case that they approach as a unique case.
Please join me in thanking Professor Cortez. Thank you, David.
Thank you all so much. I know I ramble, but this is what it's like to be in class with mine.
Yeah. Questions from the audience? Yes, right here.
I have a question. Thank you for this. My name is Tanae. I'm a second year in the AGA program, Master of Global Affairs. And I'm focusing on restorative justice, policing and mass incarceration.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just going to throw out three things, and you can decide what you want to answer. But I'm wondering your thoughts first on like the politics of criminality and its relation to within the U.S. how we use our drug law enforcement and our SWAT, and the criminality of justifying shootings during SWAT no-knock raids and warrants where it's a property warrant, which is really connected to kind of our Supreme Court system and what is allowable in those types of instances. And then, your thoughts on the weaponization of exceptionalism. So within the police force, I think Baldwin had a quote about black police officers as them actually in Harlem being more feared because they want to prove that they're not that type of black person. And exceptionalism, like even when you talk about the immigration officers, where I'm not that type of immigrant, and how it's related to this myth of exceptionalism. Even as like students at this university, I talked to a lot of my colleagues about like, I'm not an exceptional black person, I'm very regular, and I'm very much the same as the people I grew up with. And then the last or is the fact that when you said our policing leads when you talk about over policing in this country, and how that leads to mass incarceration, and then how those policies are exported globally and creating changes around the globe, like what's going on in El Salvador, and wondering if that's a part of anything that you would like to add.
So if you could pick one of those and address it so other people, and then you can talk afterwards to get more precise.
Tanae, thank you for such a fascinating set of questions, and I'm glad to hear that you're doing the work that you're doing. When I think about this field of inquiry, and I hate to describe it as such because this is life for people. And it's especially poignant ever since I had children, thinking about the world that I'm raising my kids in, where we're constantly kind of inundated by the police, right? But we suffer from what scholars have referred to as police fetishism in the United States, a notion that society would fall into complete chaos without the police. But this is a broad field of inquiry, right? There is a lot of ground to cover and a lot of different perspectives to approach the issue from. But I want to address the first question about criminality, because I always go back to the work of people like Ian Haney Lopez or Michael Omi and Howard Winant, racial formation in the United States, to think about how we assign meaning and value to skin color. right? That's essentially what the racial order is assigning some sort of meaning, value, characteristics, or behaviors to descent-based attributes, right? The way that our skin color looks, the way that our eyes are shaped, our nose shape, our hair texture, and the like. And of course, a scholar much more brilliant than I am, Khalil Gibran Muhammad, has written in The Condemnation of Blackness about how in the 1890 census, that essentially there were black men were disproportionately represented in prison because of the harsh and disproportionate policing of those communities after the ratification of the 13th Amendment. And essentially how that over-policing led to the disproportionate imprisonment of black men, which then served as a scientific and objective and data-driven assessment of black men as being inherently prone to criminality. They must be just inherently prone to criminality, and thus that's why they're overrepresented in prison. And if they're more inherent they're inherently prone to criminality, then that necessitates a more harsh approach or a more vigilant approach to these communities, right? Which just becomes this self-reinforcing cycle, or the dialectical process that Omi and Winant describe in racial formation. It's that kind of thinking about particular communities, particular kinds of people as inherently prone to criminality, or particular kinds of avarice, that has created the anti-blackness, anti-non-whiteness that we see in the United States, that is then perpetuated even by the hands of people that share membership in those communities as well. I think, again, Tanae, we could have a really long conversation. I would be really glad. Oh, please do. Oh, please do. And I'd love to go grab coffee anytime too. Yeah, but thank you for those questions. There's a lot that I'm chewing through in the back of my head, just to put that out there.
Another question. Yes, the back.
So I'm Isaac Kimmel. I'm a PhD candidate across in the sociology.
Hi, Isaac.
Hi. I'm a fellow South Texan too. I'm from Corpus.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Oh.
Also a fellow South Texan from Corpus.
Oh, great. All right. So you said a lot about how decentralized law enforcement is in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking about that as like a two-edged sword, because on the one hand, like it definitely, as someone who also comes up against limits on data collection, like I can definitely see how that makes it a lot more difficult to hold law enforcement accountable.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, does having law enforcement more embedded in local communities make them seem and internally feel and act less like an occupying force? So I'm just would further centralizing law enforcement really reduce police violence?
It's an interesting question, and one that you're not alone in having asked, right? And again, this is part of the overarching debate over reform versus abolition, right? Can you reform a system that's broken, or is it worth it? We've reformed policing since its inception through the progressive era, the good government reforms, and the kind of elimination of politics from local police forces, attempts to try to rein police agencies in using civilian review boards, trying to engage in some sort of reform of very insular communities, right? That has been noted in scholarship, and of course, it literally is visible, right? The way that police forces work. Whether or not it would reduce police violence is of course an empirical question, right? We could, it's an experiment waiting to happen. But what we might assume, or at least one of the hypotheses, more prevalent hypotheses, is that with a more regimented training process, right? With a more regimented personnel hiring or recruitment practices, that could perhaps alter the curve, right, or the slope of that police violence. But again, it also raises the question of perhaps that's not the answer, right? Perhaps we should be not just limiting the amount of police agencies that there are across the country, or at least authorities, right? But perhaps we should remove particular duties and tasks from police, right? Remove jurisdiction from police. Because, again, we have countless cases of people being in mental health crises, right? Or calling the police for help and then ending up being killed, right? Or neighbors calling and saying, I think something's going on next door because the front door's open and the window's open. And I hear loud noise in there. Police show up, and before they do anything, they shoot through an open window, right? So I think if we had different community level responders for particular issues, right? If we didn't see everything as a nail requiring a hammer to show up, perhaps that's the added element that we're missing, right? And of course, communities across the country, municipalities across the country have started to do this. And there is early evidence that police abolition, right? As it's been phrased, but essentially the farming out of other resources, right, to other people, other groups, be they government authorities or non-governmental authorities, that it has positive impacts for the civilians involved. Again, I think back to the moment last night or this morning in the car being pulled over by police, by a police officer who was, just sitting on the side of the road. And how much I clammed up. And how it was the first time in a long time that I'd been pulled over when I wasn't driving. In which case, because of the way that I look, I do this every time I'm pulled over by police. Those gut responses, those kind of visceral responses, are not uniform. Right? Not everybody has them. Sure, the other men in the car might have been nervous about like, oh no, what's am I going to get held up here? What's going on? Me having had the kind of experiences that I've had with police, I was shaking, right? Like clenching my fists and like nervous about what could happen. Because again, it's just a matter of a split second. And the fact that I know there's a firearm on that person's waist, and the clip is probably the tab is probably open on the holster, it makes me exceedingly nervous, and I'm obviously not alone in that perception.
One final question. We've reached the end of our time. Yes.
So,
Hi.
I'm Kevin. I'm a PhD candidate in the Political Science. I think we met.
Yep.
So, what I want to know is how you wake up and choose love every day. What I mean by that is, you rightfully know that we've had the abolition of slavery, we've had the abolition of Jim Crow. And then when you look at, the amount of people incarcerated today, the amount of people that have been detained or that have negative police interaction, sort of feels like we're just running in place at a certain point. And so I don't know how you are still able to be like, I'm an abolitionist, that there's still hope when you know what you know.
It's really difficult. I recognize again, though, still my privilege, right? That there was some plausible deniability, at least last night, that I knew, well, it's not as bad as it could be, right? A few minutes later, we drove by somebody and there were several squad cars around one car. And I know that Latino men are less likely to be pulled over than black men, less likely to be searched, less likely to be roughed up, and less likely to be killed by police than black men. But they are still overrepresented in those categories relative to their proportion of the population when it comes to non-Latino, non-Hispanic white men. That said, it's tough. As I've said, when I teach my race and policing course, the fact that there are too many names to have students learn about and talk about in class, and think about the circumstances. A bit ago, it's terrible of me. A bit ago, I was trying to, talk about Minneapolis and St. Louis, and we could talk about Charlotte, North Carolina. There are so many instances, Vallejo, California, right? Like, so many instances that it can start to feel like I'm just a part of this generation of people who are saying we need to do something different. But again, it's thinking about making a different world for my kids and for everybody in this room's kids, right? For the countless black and black parents who have to have the conversation with their children about what's appropriate behavior, what is life-saving behavior when you're pulled over by the police. Yeah, we can't hand off the world as it's currently constituted to this next generation.
Please join me in thanking Professor David Cortez again for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you.
There is a modest takeaway lunch right outside. Please help yourself to everything that's there. David, we look forward to your book coming out and look forward to continuing to learn from you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.